Welcome back to another episode of the Twin Elements podcast, proudly presented by Venture Hunting and Outdoors. If you're like us and passionate about hunting, spearfishing, and many other outdoor-related pursuits, with an eagerness to fast-track your learning, then this podcast is perfect for you. G'day legends, and welcome back to another episode of the Twin Elements podcast. Today's episode wraps up what was an epic month of hunting in the USA. So many of you would have heard our stories through a mix of semi-live recounts from the trip. Now I'm going to sit down and list a number of our key takeaways from that very trip. Having filled 4 of the 6 tags that we were allocated, taking a bull elk, mule deer buck, and 2 pronghorn bucks, there's certainly plenty to be proud of for both James and I. But as always the case, there's always a lesson to be learned. So today we're going to look back over the 30 odd days of hunting and identify some aspects of the trip that we would like to improve on for the next adventure, if, obviously given the chance. As always, we will conclude the episode today with a couple of your listener FAQs, which have been sent in. If you guys have any questions, please email us at info@twinelements.com.au with the subject line FAQ, or simply send either James, myself, or the Twin Elements social media accounts a message, and we'll do our best to get those answered and featured on the podcast. Alrighty, let's jump into the podcast.
Very rare nowadays that something comes into our hunting arsenal and completely revolutionises how we do something. But the walk and stalk game bar and lift kit has done just that. This combination has taken our field butchering to the next level. The game bar has 7 features, including a trekking pole, drag bar, shooting sticks, bino attachments, and so much more. The lift kit or pulley system filled a massive hole I always saw in the market. A lightweight system weighing in at only 270 grams that could fit in your pack but strong enough to lift a 200 kilo animal off the ground, leading to easier butchering and better meat care. It's a piece of equipment that every hunter needs. Check out Walk and Stalk on their website, www.walkandstalkstore.com, and use code TWIN15 to get 15% off your order.
So, as you all know and would have come to expect, James and I take our hunting extremely seriously. We're somewhat obsessed, traveling all over the planet, chasing that next hunt, next adventure. As part of this, we are always looking to scrutinize, our decisions, and often with the aid of the footage and the content that we've captured and collected, learn from these experiences as best we can. But sometimes it's just as simple as being brutally honest and reflecting on a hunt while it's fresh in your head and looking at what we did well and not so well. So at our expense, here's a bit of a list that James and I have put together discussing what we can work on in the future based off some of the lessons that we've learned from the USA. Lesson number 1, ranging and distance evaluation in a treeless environment. So what's going to be most striking when you all get to see the footage from this Montana trip, what we realised pretty early on was that the landscape was virtually treeless. Aside from a few shrubs here and there was virtually no vertical cover whatsoever. So not only did this make it super difficult to obviously stalk in on animals in the open landscape, but once getting into range, it made identifying the exact distance nearly impossible half the time, because even if the animal was stationary, it was difficult to bring your rangefinder out of your sort of binocular harness up to your eye without getting spotted. So you had to sort of range preemptively and try and guess where the animal would be. As you can imagine, this led to a couple of missed shots, mainly on my behalf, which I largely put down to the potential sort of range discrepancies that I mentioned there. Of course, there are a number of other factors such as lack of composure, obviously trying to rush the shot to get that animal on the deck, which can all play a part of this and those missed shots. However, as you're going to see, and you would have obviously heard about, I also made some of the best shots of my life during this hunt, some of the furthest distances that I've ever taken on a live animal. So Yeah, for me, this is evident mostly when I think towards the bull elk that I shot on this very same trip. So for those of you who haven't listened, please go back and check out episode 42 of the Twin Elements podcast. I think it's titled Big Bull Down. And on that occasion, I was super confident that I was going to kill the bull. A few factors led me to think that way. Obviously, based off like prior shooting to the trip, I'd say that James and I were very, very well prepared leading into the trip. Plus, every day during the trip, when we could, during daylight hours, even sometimes at night in the headlights of the car, we would be shooting the target when back at camp, whether it was to have lunch or dinner or breakfast, whatever, we were shooting the target. And we were shooting out to 60 meters in windy conditions back at camp whenever we got the chance. So for me, when I glassed that bull elk bedded down, I was actually pretty thankful, mostly because unlike a few of the pronghorn that I'd missed or shot over earlier in the trip, I physically knew that that bull couldn't move or change the range. Like once I ranged him and he was bedded there stationary as a stationary target, that sort of brought me extreme confidence. I ranged him at 60 yards, which I agree and obviously know is a very far shot, especially for me who's someone that likes to shoot 30 yards or less. But because I knew exactly where he lay, it, as I said, gave me extreme confidence. From a laying down position, unless he drastically reacted to the shot and rose and like jumped to his feet, he was always going to be there when the arrow arrived. And I just compare this to a few of the pronghorn bucks that I'd missed earlier. And both of the two shots that I'd missed earlier, I think were partly due to sort of misguided ranging and potentially the fact that, the way that they just move so quickly and erratically, even when I thought I had the right range, they were able to take a few steps and be maybe 5 or 10 yards closer or further. And, those factors definitely contributed to misses on my behalf. So, each time that I'd try and range one of those animals, I was frantically searching for, if I couldn't range the animal specifically and I had, a pronghorn buck running into a decoyed scenario, I'd done my best to sort of range small rocks or just random little shrubs on the landscape, but they weren't, that big solid tree that's quite obvious, like a 10-meter tall tree that's on the landscape that you have as like a solid permanent, I guess, marker as to the distance that, you're off that tree and then therefore the animal from that. So, it's just hard, especially when the animal's not perfectly standing there still waiting to be ranged and you're doing all of this preemptively often before you put the decoy up. It can be quite challenging. So finally, when I was able to actually take a pronghorn buck, I account a lot of that success largely to just being able to decoy him into range, obviously. And fortunately for me, he came in slow and steady. To be honest, I think he was a little bit dumbfounded by the decoy, which gave me the right amount of time to range his specific body part. And to be honest, I'd sort of learned from my lessons. Like on the previous miss, I just estimated the distance at around 25 yards and shot low. I had another encounter where I had a pronghorn buck bedded. When he stood up, I'd ranged a bush behind him, but not the pronghorn buck, and I ended up shooting high. And partly I think he dropped on the shot. But for this pronghorn buck, like the best part was that I ranged him at 44 yards and he was standing there looking at the decoy. And the best thing is he never moved. Like I adjusted my single pin option sight for that shot, drew back, aimed at the heart, and then exactly where the pin was sort of sitting on that animal is where the arrow went. And for me, that is probably my biggest takeaway from the trip. Something that we probably take for granted, especially when I compare it to hunting chittle deer here in Australia or reds or fallow during the rut. If you've got a chittle deer bedded under a shady tree, you're always going to be able to range that tree and get a very accurate range on that chittle stag. Same goes for a fallow buck on a scrape. We can obviously range the scrape, and normally in a lot of these climates and areas that we're hunting fallow and red stags in, you do have a lot of vertical cover. And unfortunately for us, we couldn't really do this as well on this Montana trip, just because the landscape that we were hunting was very much featureless. That brings us into lesson number 2. So this one I'm going to title Positioning to Kill an Animal versus Simply Seeing Animals. And the best way for me to sort of articulate that thought or that topic is to sort of say it like this. And I think the best example comes when you think of the whitetail hunters in the USA, where for them, they're sitting in a tree stand watching over a food plot during the rut, and they basically can't move. Like, they're putting all their decision making into, I guess, anticipating exactly where a mature buck is going to walk by in order to have a chance to kill him. So compare this to, I guess, a hunter being less specific and simply hanging a tree stand without the thought of, with the thought of just seeing a whitetail deer. So for me, this highlights the point perfectly and somewhat reflects sort of the trap that James and I fell into while hunting on a new landscape in the USA, where we could see quite a long distance and everything, I guess, felt super huntable. And to take this point further, I guess using the whitetail example, if you're simply trying to see a deer, you might sort of sit in a stand over a food plot where you can see long distances. Say 100 yards might be an example of this in somewhere in eastern USA. You know, you're looking over the brush edge and you're looking out into a big field or a food source. Sure, you'll see plenty of does come out into the brush. You might even see a buck following them. But before you get the chance to hunt them, they'll be out in the middle of that big cornfield or alfalfa field in that food plot and very quickly out of range. So they're perfectly viewable. You'll see them out there, but you won't be able to hunt them as such from where you're sitting in that tree stand motionless. So I want you to compare that, approach to this new mindset that I'm going to suggest that we all as hunters try and achieve and tap into a little bit more. So instead of basing success on simply seeing a deer, base the hunt strategy on being able to kill a mature animal or a mature buck in our instance. So this might actually mean, in the whitetail example, repositioning and setting up the stand, placing it 50 yards back. So no longer on the edge of the field where you think you're going to see deer moving out to feed, before dark, but moving it 50 yards back along a more prominent game trail on the downwind side of that very food plot. Sure, you might now be in much thicker scrub with less windows to see the deer, but you're going to be in a zone where a mature deer might actually walk, under the cover of some security and basically scent check that food plot for the does. So a lot of these bucks, for example, and mature deer don't want to put themselves out in the open. They don't want to be vulnerable to predators, whether it be hunters, wolves, coyotes, bears, whatever it may be. So what they will do is often, instead of going out into the food plot, they'll walk on the closest game trail to the food plot undercover and basically be able to smell anything that is out there on the field. The wind will be coming from the field past the animals that are on the field to that buck, and he remains in the safety of that thicket of scrub. So in this example, you'd be far more likely to actually kill that buck and be in the right place to actually, put an attempted stalk on or put an attempted shot on. So that's the whole point of this takeaway. I've used a whitetail deer there, but it's basically trying to position yourself to kill an animal compared to positioning yourself to see animals. And again, I want to kind of explore this concept using two examples of two different species from this particular Montana trip that James and I experienced. So let's move the conversation now to elk. I guess for us, positioning to kill on this landscape when it comes to elk is probably a little bit less relevant. We obviously undertook this hunt in September. That was the time of this hunt. So in theory for us, the elk should be rutting. For us, once again, on an extremely open and vast landscape, we actually elected to get up on the highest ridge using the elevation to be able to spy animals from up to 5 miles away at times. So our main strategy was to simply see an elk anywhere on the landscape and then hone in on that animal to find other animals. This concept, I guess, is less important for elk compared to mule deer, which you'll hear in a second. But this concept worked perfectly for us, as more often than not, seeing one elk led us to 2 elk and then, 2 elk to the whole herd. And often and hopefully we'd often see a bull that would be able to then go and hunt. So if I compare this to the mule deer buck situation, in September, which is the same time that we're obviously hunting the elk, the mule deer bucks are stripping their velvet in most circumstances, and they're trying to hide away waiting for the rut. The rut doesn't actually start for these mule deer until sort of mid-November, I'd say, in most cases in Montana. So they're very much so like rarely with the does. They just want to be hanging out, a lot of the mature bucks, by themselves or in small little bachelor mobs in a quiet little corner, basically trying to be elusive. So in this instance, simply seeing a mule deer on the landscape, especially if it was a doe, didn't really help us find a mature buck to kill it. It's not the same as that example with the elk where they're rutting, the boys are going to be with the girls. Simply seeing one elk often led us to finding, 10 elk, 20 elk, 50 elk, and a bull elk that we could then hunt and kill. So in fact, we actually with the mule deer worked out pretty quick that, despite seeing tens of mule deer does or young forky bucks each and every day, we simply weren't finding the mature bucks. They were proving to be very elusive. And again, a lot of this was because we were hunting a new landscape. And despite, our best efforts of e-scouting, putting boots on the ground when we actually got there, it turned out that we were pretty much up against it, trying to identify suitable habitat for these bucks. And it was all about just piecing things together. As I said, James and I hadn't really targeted or hunted mule deer as much as we'd hunted and planned for elk. And admittedly, this all took quite a bit of time. Our hunt strategy worked very much based on the fact that we would very closely work with OnX maps to try and find, good basins and draws. And then we would physically try and spot a buck in these areas. So it actually took multiple days to work out a bit of a pattern. And that was that the bucks would be visible for all about 10 minutes in the first part of the morning. Once it was daylight, essentially you had 10 minutes from an elevated glassing knob to try and find these bucks. And then they would virtually disappear into the deepest, darkest draws on the landscape. And what we kind of worked out was that they were, at this time of the year, again, being September when they weren't rutting, was that they were choosing safety and security over everything else. They would feed at night and then travel in the early parts of the morning. As soon as the sun was up, they were virtually gone down into these deep little dark crevices. So again, like for us, simply seeing a buck at a mile away was pretty much useless. And we worked that out quickly after a few failed stalks. By the time we saw a buck that we wanted to sort of make a move on, we were pretty much placing ourselves out of the game. Again, when you relate to this concept of not positioning to see a buck and trying to position to kill a buck. So, we found out that they would quickly disappear. We'd never be able to relocate them in the maze that pretty much was this Montana break country that we're hunting. So instead, it did take us a little bit of time, but we eventually shifted our strategy, which ultimately meant that we moved a lot closer to where we anticipated the bucks were trying to actually get back to and slip back to for their safety. And for us, as we're hunting public land, BLM, block management areas, that actually often meant, which makes sense, getting back and a lot closer to the private property that the public couldn't simply hunt next to or hunt on. So basically, we would hunt the most available public land closest to the private. And, this often was around nasty, thick draw systems where, it looked super likely, but the bucks were there because whether it be because they were right next to private, should there be any pressure, or they were just in a draw where it had multiple little heads of the gully, and if the wind would swirl, they would get notified really easily. There was always some feature that meant that the mule deer bucks had the edge and had the advantage. And I believe that as these mature bucks that we're targeting get older, they obviously know how to survive on this landscape amongst, as I said earlier, natural predators like coyotes, wolves, bears. But then again, for the human presence that is, public land hunting and hunters on the landscape. So gradually, by moving into a position to sort of intercept and kill these mature bucks, we actually basically reduced our overall visibility of the landscape. We stopped seeing as many does and young bucks. But, what we did well towards the end of this trip, and is a bit of a takeaway, as I'm sort of saying here in this long-winded message, is that By choosing to focus our attention on a single draw rather than, I guess, the whole basin as such, we were seeing less deer, but we had more chances of killing a mature buck should he come into our view. So there were some mornings we simply didn't see a buck because we had selectively, gone and sat over one little draw system where we'd sort of, with a bit of intel, knew that they were working. But it did mean that on some of those mornings where we did see a mature buck, we were seeing him at like 200 meters, 300 meters, and the chance for us to actually get into bow range and try and kill him was drastically increased. So hopefully this little shift in mindset towards, glassing position makes a bit of sense. But that was all to be said as our takeaway number 2 for this podcast. Venture Hunting and Outdoors is Australia's premier hunting retailer, starting with a team of passionate hunters and the clear mission to give Australian hunters the resource they deserve. Through community events, top quality gear, exclusive deals, and expert guidance, Venture is more than a hunting store. Venture Hunting is a community. Check out their incredible megastore in Springwood, Brisbane today. Or, if you're in Victoria, make sure you head to their Hamilton store. The team stock epic brands that we love and support, including Numa Camouflage, Hoyt Archery, Cayuga Broadheads, Dog and Gun Coffee, Ebola Stock Packs, Leopold Optics, Carnivore Collective, and much, much more. Make sure to head in store and get to know their loyal staff, or if you're out of town, make sure you head to their website, www.venturehunting.com.au, to shop all things hunting and outdoors. We will see you there. Lesson number 3. This one is basically just composure. And for me, it's more specifically a composure when decoying pronghorn. Again, this takeaway is actually a lot like rattling in a fallow buck or hind calling in a red stag back home in Australia during the rut. The main difference, however, in this instance is just the sheer speed at which pronghorn bucks, especially when they're honing in and running towards a decoy, just the sheer speed that they move. Once they commit super hard and they come running in pretty quickly, sometimes covering hundreds of meters in a few seconds. Looking back, when we could have improved our success rates when decoying is probably the work before actually setting up. So that initial planning, choosing when to pop up the decoy and commit to being in that process of decoying the buck. If we had have ranged everything around us a little bit more, potentially made sure that we had a little bit better cover and then just stay composed, we probably would have had better conversion rates. In reflection, we also probably had more time when decoying than we initially realized. So I had the pleasure of decoying pronghorn first. I think we got to America on the 3rd of September. On the 4th and 5th, we pretty much hunted pronghorn and I was up first. So after a few days of failed attempts, James was actually able to learn from my sort of trial and errors and put it together and find success relatively quickly. Removing myself from the driver's seat and being able to see it all unfold from a little bit further back behind the camera showed me that when James was actually hunting and decoying and stuff like that, I was able to actually watch what was happening. Whereas initially landing in America, me grabbing the bow, chucking the decoy up, I was sort of learning from the driver's seat. But being able to take this sort of third-party view and be able to watch James go and try and execute some of these decoying situations, I realized that just because the pronghorn buck came in so quickly didn't actually mean that we had to restrict ourselves and make it a super quick event on our behalf. So yeah, it was just like one of those things that once being behind the camera, it sort of showed me that we definitely had a lot more time to actually take the shot than it was perceived when I was the one with the bow hiding behind the decoy. And just to be extremely clear, James was actually really efficient in hunting pronghorn. He basically only had probably 2 or 3, maybe 4 or 5 setups in total. And he actually managed to shoot his buck pretty quickly in the trip compared to, obviously how many times I had attempted to get a pronghorn on the deck. So on the other hand, as you would have heard through the earlier pronghorn podcasts, I had a lot more trouble and it did take some time for me to ultimately find success on an old sort of gnarly buck. in fact, yeah, I probably, after hunting pronghorn, now declare them my new nemesis species. The way the hunts failed was actually pretty comical. And to be honest, I just can't wait to share a lot of these stories with you when reliving, the USA trip, thinking about all these takeaways. We did learn a lot, and I think you guys are really going to enjoy seeing these films when they do eventually drop in 2026. Lesson number 4 is not capitalizing in the crunch time. So this is probably more specific to James when I think of this lesson, where he had a number of super close elk stalks on this one particular bull. He was a really big bull, and a lot of these stalks ended in failure, as you would have heard in his elk heartbreak podcast earlier in the podcast series. So these stalks stand out for me as we spent so much time, nearly probably 2 weeks in fact, hunting for this one particular bull elk. It wasn't like we were going elk hunting and being like, oh, I hope we find a new elk on the landscape. We were pretty much, after I'd managed to take my bull on the second day of the elk season, we basically only really saw this one other bull elk of that same caliber, which James pretty much targeted for the rest of the trip. So jump forward a couple of weeks towards the tail end of our Montana trip. And again, after spending, whole days living within this herd, when the time came to make a move and get from, say, 100 meters, even as close as 80 yards to within bow range in the end, things just didn't quite go our way. And, this was quite probably most evident on the stalk that James covered in our podcast, Elk Heartbreak, as I said. And whether it was simply not knowing how to close the gap or just getting picked out by a cow, there were always minor errors that led to this bull staying out of bow range. And then when we finally did all the right things and actually found ourselves, at 30 to 40 meters and the bull there bugling, he was chasing cows and, in amongst another 50 or so elk, all within bow range, things just didn't quite come together, as you would have heard. And James ultimately takes a shot at that bull, but again, due to probably not being able to capitalize in the crunch time, he missed the bull completely, which is great. It was a great outcome. The fact that, we weren't able to obviously kill him lethally and humanely is the fact that the next best thing was obviously to miss him, and that's what we did. But when reflecting on this after the hunt, I sort of asked him what happened when we were walking back to the truck, and I just remember asking him, did you ever think about cow calling in particular to try and pull that bull up and, have an easier shot? And I just remember James replying like, no, when he sort of had this look on his face, and he just said, like, honestly, I was so focused on not getting busted by the cows that I didn't even think of, cow calling as an option. And this is just an example, I guess, of being so caught up in the moment, so entrenched in finding a shot opportunity, so entrenched on that outcome that, after 2 weeks of hunting this particular bull, he's finally in range and you'd do anything to sort of get him on the deck that, when the actual moment came and we missed out on putting an arrow through this bull, the simple thing like just doing a cow call might have actually, led to him being on the deck. So whilst this is one of our areas, I guess, to improve on and try and take away, it's also one of the biggest draw cards for me as to why we bow hunt. So to get into bow range of 50 or so animals, have our hearts beating through our chests, and then try and make the right play more times than not to take an animal of that caliber especially. Whilst it would have been amazing to obviously capitalize in the crunch, and that's something that we always try and work towards, get better on, and that's why we reflect and do these sort of podcasts, sometimes it just doesn't go our way. And I think that's also a credit to how much effort, time, energy we spent on this trip trying to hunt that bull. And, I'm glad in one sense to see him walk away. But again, if we had have just capitalized slightly in the crunch after all that time and effort, 2 weeks of basically hunting this bull at 30 to 40 yards, that arrow might have found its mark if we had have cow called and just done something slightly more different. And again, it might not have worked. That bull might have turned his head. One of the cows that were closer might have seen James earlier, seen him at full draw, ran in front of the bull. Anything could have happened. It could have been chaos, but just in the evidence, the slight chance that it may have worked, it was definitely worth trying.
A good backpack turns hard country into possible country. When the terrain gets serious, your pack becomes the only thing you can't afford to get wrong. That's why we use and believe in Eberle stock. Eberle stock has been making backpacks for 40 years and is trusted by tens of thousands of hunters and hikers worldwide. Their customizable packs and bino harnesses show exquisite attention to detail and years of refinement to make the ultimate backpack range. We use the Vapor 2500 for our day hunts and Vapor 5000 for our backpack hunts. If you're in the market for a new pack or bino harness, check out Venture Hunting and Outdoors in-store or online to see the full range of Eberle stock gear. You won't be disappointed.
Lesson number 5. So this is about switchability and hunt adaptability. So this takeaway is more of a concept to look into probably for next time rather than what we actually did on this hunt. So the first 2 weeks of the trip went incredibly smoothly. We filled 4 out of the 6 tags in those first 2 weeks, and we were basically firing on all cylinders and capitalising, as you would have heard, on pretty much all those opportunities that were given in the first 2 weeks. One thing I think about now that we're sort of back home with a refreshed mindset, I guess, was the possibility for James and I to change units or change zones or basically go elsewhere. And ultimately, I think that move could have potentially helped us fill those last 2 remaining tags. Ultimately, I think that the reason why we stayed committed to that area was we were sort of hunting that one target bull. And I think we probably actually got a little bit of an emotional attachment to that bull. Like after a few failed stalks, it was kind of like that redemption story that you love to see in the modern movies where you have this emotional difficulty. We got busted by the bull. There were times where we went to stalk him and the mule deer does ran through, scared the whole mob of elk. There was that heart in your throat moment of, are we going to see these guys again on public land? And then sure, 2 or 3 days later, after a lot of hard work, we end up finding that same bull and his mob of cows, and they were 3 or 4 miles away. We try and hunt him again. And it just kept leading us back to this one target bull. And I think, as stated in the previous point, we were able to get close enough to obviously have a shot. So maybe there isn't too much more to ask as far as opportunities. Like we were still obviously amongst the elk. But where this takeaway targets more so is probably the difficulty that James and I were facing in trying to find a mature mule deer buck. So for me, probably the last 2 weeks of the trip, I often wonder, like maybe we should have changed locations and try to target a mule deer buck rather than sort of been hunting for that elk and then hoping in the background that we might have stumbled across a mule deer buck. I just think we would have probably had a better opportunity had we have maybe moved elsewhere or tried a different area. Having some sort of switchability could have helped us with factors such as I know that hunting pressure was increasing. We had a lot more bird hunters and other hunters coming to the area as the month of September sort of went on. I think we often underestimated the hunting pressure as the hunt went on as well. And we certainly began to see the animals that we were watching, definitely in the case of those elk, just move larger distances to and from their feeding and bedding areas, and their habits certainly changed as the hunt went on. We definitely got too emotionally attached to that bull and to that spot that we'd sort of seen the bull and were seeing the bull. And again, changing spots, we might have been able to look for another bull. And there was no guarantee that if we did move that we would have even seen another bull of that caliber. But it is certainly a point to consider. Like, for example, I just think, what if we did move and we found a new zone that hadn't been pressured whatsoever? I know it's unlikely, but what if we found an even more mature bull in a better situation, or a mature bull of a similar caliber but with 10 cows instead of the 50? And I guess that's the risk of hunting, but it is something worth considering, which is why I've mentioned that point on switchability and hunt adaptability. If things aren't going your way, it feels like, the world's against us, which it did that last 2 weeks. We didn't fill any tags in the last 2 weeks. It might have been a point worth considering, worth changing things up, because at the end of the day, we didn't change things up and it sort of stayed on the same trajectory, closing that trip. Lesson number 6 is calling and bugling. So this takeaway is not really based on our calling or bugling at the wrong time. So I think the fact that we were able to read the situation correctly on most occasions was a good quality of ours. So it's more based on the fact that no matter how much we tried to rip a good bugle or a cow call, there's still always some uncertainty as to exactly how good that call is going to sound coming out of our mouths in a pressured situation. So, for example, if there's a bull walking in and James or I are in the driver's seat on this hunt, and we have to absolutely nail that one last cow call to get that bull to, commit, or the other alternative is that we stuff up that cow call and he catches our wind. I kind of feel that we're probably only 50% likely to be able to pull that calling scenario off and absolutely nail that call. So if I compare this, being honest, to, James and I when we're back home here in Australia where we do a red deer hind call by mouth, I feel as if when it's crunch time in a pressure situation, pressure cooker, if I'm calling to a red deer stag coming in, I'm going to nail that call, that hind call in particular, probably 100% of the time. Like, I know certain things don't always go your way in hunting, but I feel like my ability to rip that hind call correctly is going to come off 10 times out of 10. And that's just, I guess, a bit of a time and a practice thing on our end potentially. So James and I have to probably commit to putting in more time into cow calling and bugling with diaphragm calls during the off season. And it's hard because to rip a bugle at home, in our office or in the car doing cow calls is pretty irritating. I know our partners absolutely hate it, but in all honesty, it's just something that, we've got to get better at. And I know we practice a bit, but it's not under realistic scenarios. So, like, I remember on this hunt, James tried to rip a bugle with that big target bull coming into his call. And I remember his mouth made some weird whiny vocalization because, as you would have heard in the elk podcast we did earlier, his mouth was so dry after not being able to drink water out in the field for the previous 6 hours because we're on this long stalk, and the nerves and the reality that it was a pressure situation. Instead of ripping this awesome bugle and potentially getting that bull to come in that last little bit to get an arrow in him, the weird whiny sort of vocalization is what came out of his mouth. And that bull actually turned, took his cows away and left. And that was the end of one of our hunts. And that's obviously hunting to one degree, but I think being better at calling on both of our, behalves would have certainly helped more during this trip. And it will definitely help into the future, especially next time we're in the USA calling to elk during September. And for me, part of that, like, whilst I did a really cool spot and stalk on my bull elk, I think there's something to being able to call a bull elk into range and shoot him at, 10 yards as he's absolutely ripping bugles, passing steam through his mouth in those cold Montana mornings or afternoons. That sort of thought, those old Primos DVDs are like etched firmly in my mind. And that's just something that James and I, on reflection of this trip, are pretty keen to work on and try and rectify for next time. Lesson number 7 is end of trip burnout. This is probably less of a takeaway and more of just an overall assessment of the hunt. So it wasn't as apparent for me whilst hunting that James and I were probably only really hunting at 70% capacity towards the end of the trip. And that doesn't sound like a big probably deficiency to most of you, but when you're hunting and making integral decisions, on hundreds of little choices every single minute, every single hour that ultimately lead to success, in a day or in a trip or in a week or a month when it turns out that we're there for so long, being 30% less focused or 30% less energized and 30% less ready to go makes a huge difference. And as I said, while hunting, while we were out there in the bush, getting up early every morning, hunting into the evenings and getting back in the dark, it was sort of hard to notice this deficiency. Like, I didn't feel that different from day 1 to day 30. Like, I think overall I felt pretty good. But I think over 30 days of hunting, even if we say that we lose 1% every day, it doesn't feel like much, as I've said, when you compare, day 28 to day 29 or day 6 to day 7. But when you look at day 1 compared to day 30 and there's 30% difference, for us, it wasn't until we were sort of home, once we'd had a shower, slept in an actual bed and eaten good solid foods, that you reflect and losing 30 days of 1% each day adds up to being 30% less efficient than opening day of our hunt. And I think for me, looking back critically on it, the main factors that led to this for James and I was no doubt just long-term fatigue and lack of sleep over a long duration. So only getting around 5 or 6 hours most nights definitely took its toll. And this in turn leads to reduced mental sharpness and slower decision-making in the grand scheme. I think another factor that we've got to pinpoint to was probably sharing camp with other hunters. So the first 2 weeks of our trip, James and I were pretty much hunting solo. Again, we were hunting super efficiently. Just because we're hunting solo, there's no other pressures, from outsiders in the sense of when we want to eat, we eat. When we want to go to bed, we go to bed. When we need a drink, we drink. I think sharing camp with other hunters perpetuated that reduced sleep hours for both James and I, but it also changed our eating and sort of drinking and rehydrating habits. Being social, for example, and having some alcohol, once we got back to camp late at night, rather than drinking, electrolytes or a protein shake or something like that we had been doing in the previous 2 weeks, where we were rehydrating effectively for the next day, we were instead dehydrating ourselves, having a glass of alcohol, whether it be a scotch or a wine or whatever, to celebrate the day with our friends. Whilst that was amazing to do socially, it actually, I think, detracted, if I'm being critical again, from our hunt. And that's just something that I'd be mindful of for next time. Number 3, or factor number 3 under this topic, I think what contributes to this, just fatigue in general, is being in a calorie deficit. And I think being in a calorie deficit for 3 weeks leading up to the end of the trip definitely just causes our bodies to sort of eat away at themselves, essentially. And you're taking away, all your stored fats and all your protein and all this energy that the body's trying to burn just to keep, I guess, going and metabolizing. And nearly every long trip that James and I go on, despite how well you eat, despite how well you sleep, despite what you put in your body eating and drinking wise, we always go home considerably lighter. And I think that's just the demand of these tough sort of hunts when you're out in the field for such long periods of time in a caloric deficit. And the last factor that I want to sort of talk about is one that we didn't really mention that much because it's not really a pretty one, but James and I on this trip, I think may have gotten Giardia, which is a parasite. And we never got it diagnosed officially, but quite early on in the trip, James and I used some water from one of the local cattle troughs to wash some of our dirty dishes. And nearly immediately, this caused some pretty severe GRT upset for the last probably 3 to 4 weeks of the trip. I have actually had Giardia before where I was diagnosed. I contracted it when I was working in the NT, doing a lot of preg testing and cattle work as a veterinarian. And I think as a result of this, I knew sort of what the symptoms were, which we were seeing, but I also wasn't as adversely affected, maybe potentially because I had some immunity or because I had it before. Whereas James definitely got the worst of it on this trip, so much so that, nearly up to 10 times a day, if not more, James had to sort of, regardless of what we were doing or where we were, he had to run up and bail and try and find some cover in, as I said earlier, a treeless environment, sort of a coverless environment. And you had to try and go and dig a hole and go to the restroom basically. And it definitely wasn't very pleasant for him. I know he lost a heap of weight, was often quite lethargic and dehydrated towards the end of the trip. And that's just comes down to sort of every time that we would eat or drink. I know there were times we'd stop and have an Atlas Wild on the mountain, and nearly immediately James would have to go to the toilet, which no doubt, again, when you're already in a caloric deficit, you're already, dehydrated because of how hot it is, the fact that we're not drinking enough as is. When you've then got those deficits and the fact that you've got diarrhea, all of these factors that I've mentioned above definitely led to an overall burnout on the trip, especially as the trip went on into those 28, 29, 30th days of the hunting trip. We are proud to introduce Carnivore Collective, supplying some of the best meat processing gear in Australia. If you're a complete hunter who loves the benefit of being responsible for harvesting your own meat, then listen up. Take control of the whole field to freezer process with gear from Carnivore Collective. The team have absolutely everything you need. We've been running their number 32 mincer, and honestly, it's a beast. That's it. That's all you need to know. This thing chews through venison, pork, and whatever wild game meat I throw at it. It's the best mincer I've ever used, churning out over 70 kilograms of meat into mince in less than 30 minutes. But the number 32 mincer is just a start. Carnivore Collective also has saws, vacuum sealers, dehydrators, sausage fillers, jerky gear, sausage spice mixers, seasoned rubs, and more. Literally the full end-to-end range for anyone serious about producing high-quality wild game meats at home. And the best part? Carnivore Collective has set up an exclusive offer for you, our listeners. Simply use code TWIN10 at checkout for 10% off your order. If you want to check out their range in person, then Venture Hunting is now stocking Carnivore Collective products in store and online. Lesson number 8, and this is more of a suggestion again, or probably if I was to plan the trip again, knowing what I know now, my lesson would be restructuring the month into separate hunt blocks. So this is my last takeaway of things that we can work on. And again, as I was sort of alluding to there, it's more of an afterthought to try and combat some of the struggles that we faced in the last week or two of the trip in particular. If I could wave a magic wand, the first 2 weeks of the trip, I wouldn't change a single thing. The last 2 weeks of the trip, I would change drastically. And this is just one of those things that might have helped. So potentially breaking the month-long trip into smaller hunts within the bigger hunt could have worked more positively for us. Splitting things into a 4 or 5 day block with a clear objective. For example, days 20 to 24 while we're out there, we'll be solely chasing a mule deer buck in location X. Day 25 of the trip, we'll be traveling, shopping, and restocking supplies. Day 26 to 29, we'll be chasing elk in this location X, So there you've got a 10-day block, just say, where from the 20th to the 29th, you're going to spend 4 or 5 days hunting mule deer, have a day of rest in between 4 or 5 days hunting elk. Doing something like that might have helped later in the trip, rather than just trying to wing it and make sort of decisions that we were making day to day. Like James and I, towards the end of the trip, again, because we only had the 2 tags remaining, I had a mule deer hunt, James had an elk hunt. I think some of that decision making was also somewhat impaired by the fact that we were just so overly fatigued and tired. Whereas if we had it written down somewhere that, okay, regardless of what happens, we're going to go here and we're going to try and hunt only for mule deer, it might have given that person a bit of a break while they were filming, not to think about anything. They know that for the next 3 days, they've just got to film, the other person's hunting, and then in 3 days, they're up. They're making all the decisions, they're hunting that mule deer, for example. That's just the sort of stuff that I think we really executed well, especially at the beginning of this adventure. For example, like to be specific on this point, I think because the opening dates, like when we arrived, was on the 4th and 5th of September. So we could only legally hunt pronghorn. So it was kind of refreshing to go, regardless of what happens today, we are hunting pronghorn. Then September 6th rolls around and that was opening day of elk season. So suitably, we basically went, okay, we are primarily hunting elk. Sure, if a pronghorn buck walks within bow range or a mule deer buck is spotted that's an absolute, ball terror, like a really impressive mature buck, we'll go for it. But as far as we're concerned, on these next few days, we are hunting elk. And that was sort of our plan. And I think because we had a bit of a hunt plan and a hunt strategy, it kept us extremely dialed. Whereas I think, definitely as the trip went on, it got to the point of like, oh, we saw that big bull yesterday. Maybe we should just go and try and find him again. Oh, yeah, we're not really seeing mule deer. We should go try and find that big bull again. Oh, I'm a bit tired from hunting that big bull elk. Let's just go and look for a mule deer. Like it wasn't based off like any strict analysis and it wasn't based off any planning. So I think looking at the trip in general as well, deer were definitely less of a priority for both James and I. And maybe that's why we also didn't really structure the trip to try and find, a mature buck. Definitely not at the same level that we try to find the mature bull elk. And I think part of that too is because when we got, information to go and hunt this unit, we knew that we were going to get opportunities on pronghorn and mule deer, and we were hoping that we'd find, a mature bull elk. I think once we found that there were elk there and we had seen my bull elk, which I ended up taking, and then the bull elk that James ended up stalking, I think that gave us so much momentum in the sense of like a bull elk, a mule deer is extremely fun to hunt. The pronghorn were extremely fun to hunt. But when you think of like Western big game hunting and you think of bulls bugling, there's not much else that really compares. And I think that our pursuit of trying to probably get a big bull elk on the deck, especially with probably impaired decision making towards the end of the trip, just meant that, if we had have restructured the month into separate hunt blocks, we might have found more success sort of later on in the trip. Alrighty, so that wraps up the major points that I wanted to sort of improve on for next time. The next segment of the show switches things slightly, and we're going to focus on the positives now. So not that anything we mentioned earlier was like an overt or outright negative. I think it's just little takeaways and things that, we can obviously make better decisions. We can obviously plan things better. We can obviously look after ourselves more. But the way that we put in energy into hunting, effort into hunting, none of that I would replace. It's just tiny little bits of tinkering. So looking into the things we did well now, and these are the things that we want to build on for our next adventure. Lesson number 1, filming the hunt. So, as always is the case at the forefront of any Twin Elements hunt, sharing the story and capturing content is absolutely vital for us. We always strive to film the hunt to the highest quality, so much so that James and I often give up opportunities to shoot an animal just to make sure that it's all captured on film for you guys, the viewers, but also for us on a self level. We love obviously going back and being able to rewatch these films, have these memories and learn from them ultimately. So for example, a bull elk walks in, is off film behind some brush. So we naturally wait for another opportunity, but to get that bull on footage where the hunter can obviously take it, but ultimately the bull wins us. On this hunt, the open landscape for us certainly made it a lot easier to film. And that was simply because there was less trees and vertical cover. We weren't really losing animals to the thick brush, which can occur in other regions in Montana. These thick brushy areas, especially with plantations of pine and other hardwoods, can make calling in bull elk on film a lot more difficult. Like in one aspect, you want cover to be able to conceal the two people, one cameraman, one hunter, obviously. But in another instance, the thick brush makes it difficult to capture the shot and have the same angle between both hunter and cameraman. So the open terrain, while enabling better filming, did make stalking more difficult. Trying to get two people into bow range in these open landscapes had its own challenges for sure. But through moving slowly and tactfully, James and I were able to definitely get it done, as you'll see. We worked really, really well overall as a hunter and cameraman duo, capturing all 4 tags that we were able to fill, capturing all of those moments on film. And overall, the lenses and gear that we packed for filming on this trip seemed to be the right mix. To be honest, since our Bangtang trip in 2024, when James and I didn't actually go to the US, we stayed in the Northern Territory in Australia, we found a really nice mix of lenses and camera gear in general to sort of capture the hunt. Our 70 to 200 millimeter lens has definitely been a game changer for us for our over-the-shoulder style of hunts, especially where it's difficult to sort of set up a tripod and be stealthy when you're getting close, say that sub 30 to 50 yards. That 70 to 200 mil lens is where it really fills a gap for us. And previously we had like a 24 to 70 mil and then a 150 to 500 or a 150 to 600. Whereas, as I said, that 70 to 200 millimeter lens has been awesome for especially the rut this year, where we were able to call red stags into bow range, just not having to put a big lens on a tripod. We're still able to get that close, footage of stags coming in from 50 meters away. But then when they're at 7 yards, you can still zoom out and get the shot over the shoulder of the hunter and get that animal in the frame. So that's been absolutely essential for us and for us filming these hunts. And I can hear all of you guys asking. So for those of you interested, James and I filmed what we're confident to say is around 12 parts or 12 different films from this USA series. There's going to be pronghorn decoying, bull elk bow hunts, and even a few mule deer stalks there in that film series. So look forward to that in 2026. Takeaway number 2, I would say, is gear choice and packing the essentials. So literally everything that James and I packed for this adventure got used whilst on the trip. So everything we packed was needed. Nothing that we needed wasn't packed. It's that simple, which is very much great from our perspective. Obviously, when you're going to the USA, you only have a certain amount of kilogram baggage allowance, and you don't want to waste, either space or weight with gear that, doesn't work or isn't needed or not required. So James and I have recorded a bit of a gear dump video from this trip, which will drop on the YouTube channel. So stay tuned for that, as it's going to be a B-roll rich sort of video. Again, a bit of a gear dump walkthrough of all the gear that we used on this trip, what we liked, what we didn't like about it. And for a bit of a disclaimer, there's not much that we didn't like. Overall, the gear that we took over there really, really worked well for this style of hunt. And for those of you that can't wait for that video to drop in early 2026, you can go back and listen to episode 36 of the Twin Elements podcast. That podcast is titled USA Gear Guide, where James and I think we were actually in a hotel room in either LA or we were packing for the trip in Australia, just ready to get set off and go on the trip when we recorded that. So that was looking ahead and packing and trying to decide on what gear to take. So you can obviously hear our rundown and decision making for that. But pretty much all of the gear that we took and talk about in that podcast was relevant and will be discussed in this video or breakdown gear dump that we're going to do in the new year. So that's just something that you guys can look at if you can't wait till then. Takeaway number 3. So this one is accuracy and archery practice. So leading into this trip, both James and I were shooting the best each of us have ever shot. We were both practicing out to extended ranges, shooting super tight groups and feeling absolutely dialed, which was very, very nice, I must say. But what we put this to is before the trip, both James and I went into venture hunting their Springwood store in Brisbane, Queensland, where we constructed our new Hoyt bows with all of the gear that we were going to take over to the USA and that we like to shoot and have on our bows normally. We did these bow builds with the assistance of Dustin Ollerman. So for those that don't know, Dustin is the owner of Lethal Bowstrings with years of professional tuning and archery work under his belt. He now works at Venture Hunting and runs their archery department, basically. So as I said, he was there rearing to go, ready to help us out. Very much as the expert, we were just there to sort of watch, and he ran us through how to basically build a bow from scratch. So getting a full bow tune and setup of these brand new Hoyt Carbon RX9s was epic. Going from our old RX1s and RX1 Ultra respectively, there's like 8 years of development in those Hoyt bows, as you can hear just by the number. So we were pretty keen to, one, obviously stay with the Hoyt setups, but just change to faster, easier to draw bows. And as a result of this, both James and I actually went up from 70 pounds to 80 pounds, which we were able to pretty much draw with ease. We then chucked on our Hamsky rest, our option sights and quivilizers by Option Archery, and then looked more closely towards our arrow setup. So we got these new bows zipping out our day 6 shafts. I was shooting 275 spine HD shafts. James was shooting 250 spine HD shafts. And we had the Cayuga broadheads up front of the pointy ends. Again, on this trip, James was shooting the pilot cuts and I was shooting the Cayuga Zots. And all of this with 80 pounds of Hoyt behind it. We generally like to shoot out as far as we can prior to these trips to know our limitations. Always aiming for groups to be within 1 inch for every 10 meters gained. So the easiest way I can explain that for example, is at 10 meters, I want to be shooting 1-inch groups. At 20 meters, 2-inch groups. Right out to say 60 meters, I want all of my arrows to be within a 6-inch group around that target. Having built up this confidence prior to the trip and shooting extremely well, as a result of that prior shooting and archery practice and getting my bow tuned and dialed, I was able to confidently take that, reinforcement and go and shoot animals on this trip the furthest I've ever shot before. And it's not that I want to do that all the time. Like personally, I really love getting into sub 30, sort of setting that as a bit of a limitation on myself and trying to get in as close as possible. But however, on this trip with limited cover and lots of eyes in most instances on a lot of these stalks, it was actually better for me to sort of settle at a comfortable range and shoot at a relaxed animal that was completely unaware. In the example of my elk, an animal that was bedded, had no idea I was there, rather than move in and try and get closer to, 30 to 40 elk and then wait for that bull to stand and then be moving in between other animals on that open landscape. So hopefully you guys can understand that concept I'm trying to talk about there. Like for me, it was better to shoot at that animal relaxed at 60 than, again, if that bull elk was at 20, ducking and weaving in between cows and those cows are moving, it can become a little bit more chaotic and you're like not necessarily focusing on that little spot that you're trying to hit and trying to test and account for all these different eyes and ears and noses that you've got to get past. So I think ultimately for takeaway number 3, archery and archery practice is vital and always has been vital to James and I, but just with the new invigoration of those new bows, it really set a bit of a tone for this trip. And now moving forward for a lot of our bow hunts, we are shooting better than we've ever shot before. And it's a really, really nice feeling.
When it comes to broadheads, Cayuga broadheads set the standard. Their full range is designed for every bow hunter, giving you unmatched accuracy and cutting power. The pilot cut is my personal favourite. It's engineered for smooth flight, deep penetration, and lethal performance, making it one of the best broadheads on the market. Go to their website today and use code TWIN10 to get 10% off your order. Don't leave your shot to chance. Upgrade to Cayuga broadheads and take your hunting to the next level.
Takeaway number 4. So this one is glassing and spotting animals from long ranges. So this was no doubt one of our strengths of the trip. Constantly being able to find game because we were able to identify and locate animals from long ranges it was awesome. It meant we were always in the game. And whether it was a pronghorn, mule deer or an elk, we were able to spot animals from up to 5 miles away at times. And we often achieve this through using, I guess, quality optics. Like there's definitely a gear component to it when assessing like our success glassing. So, without quality optics, it's going to be a lot more difficult, but we obviously use the Leopold binoculars and they're absolutely amazing bits of gear. On this trip, we were using the 10x50 Santiums. They're a nice lightweight, binocular, but they're also extremely clear, have great, viewing capabilities, a good range and everything like that. But what we also had was being able to utilize our Leopold spotting scope on a solid tripod. And I emphasize solid tripod because there were times on this trip where the wind was absolutely gusting like 20, 30, 40 knots, whatever it may have been. And if we didn't have that solid tripod, even with the really good quality optics on top and the spotting scope, I don't think if we didn't reduce that wind shake, we wouldn't have been able to have a clear sort of precise or concise view. And then 2, so even if you have the best optics, but you have no idea of animal behavior or glassing technique, you're not really going to be able to maximize, that vantage point that you might be on. So the second point when it comes to glassing animals from long range is simply just gridding the area. And again, this allowed for us to tick off an area more thoroughly, more precisely, and then move spots confidently that we'd actually identified, any and all animals that were potentially on that landscape. So if you can imagine, by moving left to right and then down one objective or one sort of viewfinder, moving back right to left or left to right, however you want to do it, but basically just going in a smooth line from left to right, down one step on the mountain, right to left, down one step, left to right, and just doing that being able to pick up any animals and not miss any bits of land. That's an important strategy to basically being able to identify that there's no animals and that you're then ready to move on. Point number 3 that I think really helped us with this glassing animals from long range was just being able to assess where the animals were likely to be at certain times of the day. For example, on the super cold mornings where it was like 0 degrees and incredibly windy, animals like even the elk, for example, which really like the cold, enjoy being out on those open faces, sometimes in the rain. When it's that cold and windy, even they would be tucked away in the gullies and trying to like stay on the sunny faces, trying to get warm. So compare this obviously to when it's 90 degrees and it's incredibly sunny, there's no wind, like it's hot. Just being in the shade, you're hot. You know, there's a midday sun out cooking the landscape. Animals would be tucked away in those shady little spots, most often on the western faces. So knowing that and overall combining sort of our binos, spotting scopes, utilizing those tactics that I've mentioned above, it really helped us spot a lot of game during the trip, which is absolutely essential for being able to then put us in more stalks on animals that we had tags for. Takeaway number 5, target acquisition in the spotting scope. So I know I've just spoken a little bit about glassing and optics, but again, this relates to the spotting of game and glassing, but more specifically, the action of being able to convert from either the naked eye and seeing something on the landscape or seeing something through the binoculars and then moving from, you know, the wider objective of the binoculars to the more precise zoomed in ability of the spotting scope really quickly and effectively. And there's a certain skill in doing this that can't be overlooked. For example, to try and put this into context, I've had this similar thing with rifle hunters on my guided chittle deer hunts where, you know, I'll be walking into a range of a chittle deer mob. We've just spent 2 hours stalking them. I've been in front through my binos and I get them up to a tree and, you know, they're shouldering a rifle the whole time for 2 hours as we get into range of these chittle deer. At like 80 meters, I say, okay, that stag's near that tree there. And then I get them in front. They rest their rifle on the tree in front and they go to find that stag through the objective of their rifle scope. And they simply cannot find the stag. They cannot relocate that target animal quick enough. And it's just one of those things that I think that because James and I operate probably so much camera gear and have done so for such a long period of time, this target acquisition as such comes to us really quickly and really quite easily. And furthermore to this, and something that I think will assist a lot of people, is I want to give a bit of a shout out here to an awesome bit of gear that we use quite extensively during our glassing sessions in Montana. So the MagView spotting scope adapter is, as I just said, an awesome bit of gear and something that we used a lot on this hunt. They're relatively cheap, and if you looked on our socials of late, you probably would have seen it. A lot of the footage that we've actually posted of, you know, mule deer, elk, whatever it may be, pronghorn, is actually through that spotting scope adapter. It allows you to like chuck your phone on there and view and film deer or animals, whatever it may be. So as I said, the MagView spotting scope's an awesome bit of gear, and it allows for easier filming with a phone or a device through the spotting scope. And again, I can hear you guys saying like, how is that an advantage? I acknowledge it might not sound like much of an advantage, but I put it to you this way. Say you see an animal for a few short seconds and say you identify that it's, you know, a buck, and he walks into a crevice and can't be seen again. By filming this little sequence on your phone through the MagView adapter on your spotting scope and hitting record, you can effectively relive that scenario over and over again, enjoying the benefits of 1, trophy assessment of that buck disappearing into that crevice, and then 2, you can also pinpoint the exact location of that animal. For example, by being able to look back on your phone, which has now captured that content, that little encounter, you can then look back, and even though the buck's disappeared and gone, you can go and identify the exact rock that he went behind or the exact tree stand that he disappeared into, rather than sort of have to try and relive that excitement of, oh yeah, I saw a buck go behind there, but where was it? You don't have any evidence, any recording of that process. So again, rather than guess, you've just captured all of that information and can make better decisions as to, for us, a lot of this comes down to whether we're bailing off the mountain to try and run 2 miles and go and kill that particular animal, or if we're going to continue glassing and sit there on the mountain for, all day, the next week, trying to find an animal that fits that bill. And I just think by having that little device, being able to, again, as this point explains, have really good target acquisition through a spotting scope quite quickly, just means that you've got an extra few seconds to try and assess that animal's trophy potential, assess whether it's an animal that you're trying to pursue, and then make those decisions accordingly with that information that you gather. Takeaway number 6 is physical preparedness and conditioning. So as always the case, I started off this podcast, I guess, by saying that James and I were serious about our hunting. So naturally for us, that means leading fit and active, healthy lifestyles that support that dream or goal. In reality, we never really go out of hunting shape to a degree, which ultimately for us means that it's easier to ramp up and get in shape for a trip of this magnitude. So from day 1 to day 30 of this hunting trip, we never really slowed down physically. As I said earlier, there was definitely some mental fatigue and loss of clarity and just a depreciation in focus, I guess. But despite being tired at times, I never actually felt physically sore or beaten or anything like that. Despite, daily 15 to 25 kilometer days on the legs and in the boots, the months of stair machines and rucking prior to this trip certainly helped James and I. It has also sort of helped with things that you don't even think about as such. Like we were just trying to get fit so that we can go and hunt an animal. We didn't actually get fit with the intention of having easier pack outs and being able to retrieve meat easier from where we were hunting. And that's just one of the added benefits that obviously, is a second or a flow-on effect of being generally fit. And whilst we weren't hunting super steep terrain on this trip, the pack outs were done with quite a lot of ease, to be honest. They all were also done incredibly quickly. Like we were packing bull elk out in a matter of hours rather than a matter of days. And I think just being fit, active, ready to go, this allowed for us to actually be back out hunting pretty quickly. By being able to pack out the meat quickly, not having sore backs, not having sore legs, packing all this meat out with heavy loads, we were also better able to care for the meat, especially when, we were hunting in hot, dry conditions where there was minimal shade. By being able to get that meat out of the sun in a matter of hours rather than a whole day and then cooling down, hanging, it just meant, again, it was one of those things where physical preparedness, conditioning prior to the trip helped us out so much during the trip. And it's just one of those things that you can't value enough when hunting, especially doing these big, international trips that have high stakes for us. Takeaway number 7 is the last one. So this one is just punching tags. So on this hunt, James and I filled 4 of the 6 tags that we were allocated. As you would have heard, we filled 2 pronghorn buck tags, 1 bull elk tag, and 1 mule deer buck tag. So we were hunting a new zone, new unit, new everything really. Whilst we had hunted Montana previously, we weren't really sure what to expect heading into this trip. So in all honesty, we probably did better than we ever really thought we could. And, we'd obviously hoped that, this place would allow for opportunity on all 3 species that we had, all tags, whether it be a pronghorn, mule deer or bull elk, without having to try and move too far. Like we wanted to hunt for opportunity, and that turned out to be mostly true. The elk, in summary, were mostly rare, yet we definitely got opportunities, as you would have heard, on mature bulls, like for each of us. In fact, the bull that I managed to take sort of blew my expectations, and to do it so early on in the trip, I think one of the benefits of that was that it gave us time to then focus on James trying to fill the tag that he had with an equally good bull. Whereas if I had have shot my bull on day 20, it only would have given James 10 days to try and shoot a mature bull, and thus our standards might have dropped. Whereas I think by shooting my bull on day 2, it meant that we then had 20 odd days to try and get James a bull elk. So having filled both pronghorn tags after never hunting them before was truly making the most of the opportunities, and as it turns out was one of my favorite, new species to hunt. To go to Montana as foreigners or non-residents, and then coming home, doing this hunt as a DIY and succeeding, I guess, in the way that we did, we probably exceeded our expectations. To help sort of put all of this into perspective, I went, because just out of my own curiosity, James and I were a bit, disappointed at times that we didn't fill all 6 tags. We certainly felt that we could have and wanted to, being such driven hunters. But again, we were sort of forced to, when we come home and talk to people, especially people from the US, and they were very much, putting emphasis on how much we'd achieved whilst over there. I did look into some figures from Montana's Fish, Wildlife and Parks, and it was interesting to see that pronghorn, especially with archery gear, is estimated to be around 10% success rates in Montana. The same can be said for mule deer with archery gear, is estimated to be around 25 to 35% success rates. And finally, for elk, it drops pretty dramatically with archery equipment and is estimated to be at around 5 to 15% success rates. So even if you say 10% for pronghorn, 30% for mule deer, and 10% for elk, I'm not good at statistics, I'm not good at mathematics, but I know that when you try and work out, probability and combining those odds of those individual success rates across 6 tags is where it starts to actually get a bit more impressive. And it wasn't until I sort of did the maths that, only 0.06 or roughly 1 in 1,600 people would have been able to fill those, same 4 out of 6 tags that we did. So to put it simply, we punched way above the statistical average, which, again, James and I would have loved to have taken 6 out of 6 tags, but both James and I are able to walk away from this trip incredibly proud of what we achieved. And we're eager to get back there, relive in some of those hunts that, created so many epic memories for us. And again, I wanted to finish on that point where, I obviously at the start of this podcast spoke about some of, the lessons that we wanted to learn from Montana, but it's also really important that we focus on some of the things that we did really, really well whilst in Montana. And the fact that we were able to fill 4 of those 6 tags is definitely one of those things. And to be able to do that with my best mate, my brother James, and the co-host of this podcast, was really, really meaningful. And as I said, I'm glad that we got to come back and share that all with you guys, and hopefully you guys can learn from some of our, trials and tribulations, but also some of the things that we did well whilst in the US. Whether it's hunting, fishing, hiking, or any other activity in the great outdoors, Dog and Gun Coffee is ready to fuel your adventures. Their preloaded drip filters are a game changer and help you enjoy cafe quality coffee in the field. Their dark roast, the Samba blend, is my personal favourite. Even when I'm at home, I'm drinking Dog and Gun Coffee. Set yourself up with a subscription to get monthly shipments of the good stuff. With this subscription, not only is coffee delivered hassle-free to your door, you can also enjoy benefits such as discounted coffee and entry into a range of their epic giveaways. The legends over at Dog and Gun have extended their support to you, our valued listeners, to help you discover your brew of choice today. Use code TWIN10 at checkout for $10 off your first order. Shop today via their website or head in store to Venture Hunting and Outdoors, who also stock the range. It's that time of the show where I'm going to jump in and answer some of your listener FAQs. So as always the case, if you have any questions following this podcast, please send us an email with subject line FAQ to info@twinelements.com.au, or simply DM either Twin Elements, Ayden Doumtsis Outdoors, or James Doumtsis Outdoors a message on social media, and we will strive to answer those for you and potentially feature them on a future episode of the podcast if we think they're going to benefit the greater audience. For a bit of housekeeping, I also wanted to touch on a few responses that I received via direct message to last week's Christmas gift guide podcast, which launched last Monday. I've had a lot of people message me saying things like, what about some gifts under $100? Or what about gifts for the poor people that are out here hunting? And to be honest, that's totally fair. In reflection, when I did that, 10-part Christmas gift guide, featuring things obviously like the lower boots, the walk and stalk game bar, the iron gate knives, a Garmin InReach, I acknowledge that a lot of those gifts are, probably those high hitters. They're stuff that's quite expensive, but I think I went that way in that podcast because when I think of hunters, I think of people who can be incredibly hard to buy for. Like I know I am. My partner, for example, always asks me what I want for my birthday or for Christmas or for a gift for any other random occasion. And unfortunately, the general truth when it comes to me is that generally when I'm as a hunter, like when I need something, it's urgent. And because it's a required bit of gear, I go out and I buy it myself. So, and you just add to that hunting and the outdoors in general can be quite expensive. You're buying specialist gear, whether you like it or not. So in light of that feedback to the Christmas gift guide, I've come up with a few cheaper alternatives to fill a stocking this Christmas with, and I'll mention them now. So anyone that thought, the Christmas gift guide was a bit expensive, were priced out of that. I did mention things like, the Twin Elements prints, for example, which I'll plug again here. I did also mention the Venture Hunting gift guide, but here's a few other cheaper alternatives. So something like trail cameras, you can get trail cameras from, Aldi, from Bunnings, wherever it may be. It doesn't have to be, those super fancy, expensive ones that are cellular cameras with 5G that send you a photograph, to your phone. You can get trail cameras that are quite inexpensive, and it's the perfect time with the fallow rut coming up. You can chuck it on a scrape, chuck it on a red deer wallow, chuck it over a dam and see what's coming in over the summer months. So that's going to be a great option for you guys and girls looking for something to get a hunter. Something like rattle bags, or even if you've got fallow buck sheds and don't want to spend any money, simply, drill through them, tie some rope or a lanyard through them, make it so that it's got handles. That's going to be an awesome gift for someone that hunts, a pair of sheds that they can use as rattle bags. Even if you're saying you don't have power tools, you can always go and whip up and cook. As long as you're a good hunter and you've got some meat in the freezer, go and whip up a batch of jerky or some sort of homemade snack like a salami. Giving that to people in a freeze-dried sort of vacuum-sealed bag is going to be an awesome bit of kit. They're going to be able to enjoy it over the rut or their next hunting adventure. And the last one I'll mention here is just simply Yeti gear. Again, I know people are going to go, Yeti's so expensive, but you can go and buy someone a Rambler for like $40. They've got heaps of little shot glasses, heaps of different things. Hell, go and buy them a dog bowl, drinking bowl, whatever it may be. That's all under $100. And you can buy that friend, family member, partner, whatever it may be, their new favorite drinking mug. So hopefully that helps out and covers a few cheaper options and some gifts under $100 for those people that sent me a message and anyone else thinking the same thing. The next question is, do you prefer camo patterns or solids for concealment? So as you would have seen on our socials, we basically go and hunt, record it, post it on the socials. And as you would have seen on the socials, James and I definitely prefer camo patterns. Simply put, we just think that, a textured, broken up figure is much more difficult to make out than a solid blob, whether it's orange, blue, black, grey, green, whatever solid colour you're thinking. If there's something that's constructed of, textured, broken up patterns, I just think that's going to be a lot more difficult to see when put right next to each other. So, for example, to sort of try and illustrate this, think of like a chital deer compared to a water buffalo. And I know a lot of you are thinking, a large black object that's massive is going to be a lot easier to see than a chital deer, which has its spots. But even despite the size discrepancy, it is those spots and those colorations and textures and patterns and things that make it so hard for, us as hunters to often see chital deer when they're in that dry grass. And I know a buffalo at times can be hard, and even for a big animal, sometimes you come around the corner and you're like, geez, how did I not spot that? But I just know my eye, when I'm looking for a pig or a buffalo, is so much easier to find than even some of those light coloured mennel fallow deer, even a chital deer hind, all these animals that have a bit of a pattern. And I just liken it to a lot of the predators that are out there on the landscape, whether it be a leopard, a tiger, African wild dogs, for example. A lot of these predators always have patterns. And I think that just breaks up their outline and allows them to get closer to animals. And again, I want to be transparent. Like when addressing this question, patterns and solid camo is probably less of the issue. Moreover, I think how people move and stalk through the bush in those camo or in those patterns is probably more of the larger topic that we've got to address here. Like even if a tiger just goes and runs across the landscape, you're obviously going to see it. So I have nothing against wearing a solid color like, a desert brown, a brushy green, whatever color it might be, especially if you're moving slow, keeping to the shade, moving in direct lines and reducing your hand movements. You can have the best camo out there. You can be running Numa camouflage, Kuyu, Sitka, Spiker, whatever camouflage is out there on the market. But I guarantee you, if you're moving erratically or you pick bad lines to approach, an animal when stalking those animals, they are going to see you 9 times out of 10 despite what you're wearing. So hopefully that answers the question there. And I appreciate you sending that in. Again, I just think we all like to focus so much on specifics when it comes to gear and different little preferences. And again, at the end of the day, it's going to be up to each and every one of us. But if you adopt, better hunting strategy, as I said, like moving slowly, keeping to the shade, moving in direct lines, moving when the animals aren't looking, have their heads down, all that type of stuff, regardless of what you're wearing, you're going to get nice and close and be in the position to take one of those animals. So hopefully that helps. That is all for today's podcast, Legends. I just wanted to say a quick special thank you to everyone who listens to the podcast. Recently, we've had what's called the Spotify Wrapped feature drop on Spotify, which is, of course, one of the platforms where we drop and air the podcast. So it has been super cool to see our podcast, the Twin Elements podcast, pop up in a lot of our listeners' top listens for 2025. Even some of you sickos listen for like hundreds of hours, which is funny. I can't imagine someone listening to my voice or James's voice for 100 hours, but to see that support from you guys is absolutely amazing, and we greatly appreciate it. As I said, James and I, only really kicked this podcast off in 2025, and we never dreamed of achieving things like that. So once again, thank you all very, very much. As you're hearing this, our YouTube channel is absolutely cranking. We are dropping film after film for the next 20 odd weeks. Please make sure that you guys all subscribe, comment, like, do whatever you have to, share it with a friend. All of these films that we're putting out there, we just ask that you guys tune in each Wednesday night from 6 p.m. Australian Eastern Standard Time and catch the new releases as they come to our Twin Elements YouTube channel. We put a lot of work in to make sure that these are available to you guys. We put a lot of time, obviously, hunting, filming those, then editing them so that they're presented to you in a nice little film to watch at home with friends, family, whoever it may be on a Wednesday evening. Even if you go back and you've missed a few of the films that we've put out previously, we guarantee that you're going to enjoy them. If you like what we do on the socials, you like hearing our stories here on the podcast, then you're going to like the Twin Elements YouTube channel. Lastly, before I sign off, I just want to say A massive thank you to all of you legends. Please continue to subscribe, review, and rate this podcast. I see the 5 stars creeping up, and just the FAQs that come in, the topic suggestions that come in, all of your feedback. We're really building a really tight-knit community here in the Australian hunting scene and beyond. And for that, James and I are incredibly grateful, and we can't wait to catch you on the next episode of the Twin Elements podcast. Cheers.